All right, here we go. So welcome everyone. Morning. Well, morning for you guys, afternoon for me. How are you both doing? Biddle, how's your day going so far?
Excellent. Getting the day started bright and early here on my favorite spot to be, our Twitch channel. So lovely.
Awesome. And Joe, how's it going?
Fantastic. Happy to be here on the Twitch.
Everyone loving the Twitch space. Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. So welcome everyone to the Keys to AWS Optimization, the show where we share stories, concepts, and solutions to help you unlock your cost optimization at AWS. I'm your host, Stephanie Gooch. My co-host today is Michael Biddle, and our amazing customer, our first customer on the show, Joe Daly is our guest today. Ooh, very exciting. And so he is going to be he's going to be chatting today a bit about kind of starting a FinOps team or a cost optimization team. Again, as per my t-shirt, is very on point for the conversation. The FinOps Foundation merch or kind of swag that I got a few years ago, and we'll probably touch upon who the FinOps Foundation is and what they do and how Joe and I have been involved with them before.
Yeah.
Are you wearing one as well?
See, but I got the other one. I got the other one.
That one, when I roll out a bit, you can see it a bit better. But yeah, the lighting, I've worn that shirt before and I swear no one could tell what I was wearing. So as per everybody, please feel free to comment and put questions in the chat. We love to hear from you. We want to know what's going on, anything to do with the conversation we're having today, but also anything about cost optimization in general. We want to know what's going on. If you have any questions, and we can look at those, or maybe people in the chat might be able to help you out as well. So Joe, why don't you give us your 1 minute origin story, a bit of background about yourself and what you do?
1 minute origin story. I'll only take 5 minutes. So my background. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Daly. I am the director of optimization services at Nationwide, the American Nationwide, not the UK Nationwide. We do, we're a protection company offering insurance products and investment retirement products. We have Peyton Manning on our commercials with Brad Paisley and all those. It's if you're United States domestic, you know us well. I have a background. My background is not in IT. It is in finance. I started off as a tax accountant, spent years doing that, and then moved to IT finance, IT portfolio, weird hop to VMware operations manager, and then cloud engineering and cloud services. So I've done that at 2 different companies now. I started off at Cardinal Health, where I started the cloud optimization services team there, and then just joined Nationwide about 3 years ago. It started our fantastic, amazing FinOps team there.
Awesome. So, as you said, you kind of came from a finance background. So let's start off there. So when we talk about creating a FinOps team, we always want to bring in like the finance, the developers, the managers, stakeholders, the different groups. How did you find that kind of transition from finance into cloud? And what were some of the really good lessons learned you maybe did, if you could think back to all those years ago?
Yeah, so I mean, it really started connecting when I was in IT finance, and like back then 10, 15, between maybe let's call it 12 and a half. So let's say, it's all very capital driven, right? That has the most amount of capital budget in most enterprises is in the IT space, because you got your hardware licensing, any sort of development products. And so there was just a tremendous amount of project-based work in capital budget. And I spent so much time with teams trying to explain why I couldn't just reclass their capital budget to expense budget, or their expense budget to their capital budget. It's just not the way accounting works. It wasn't, they would accuse me of not thinking outside the box, but it's just like, I'm sorry, I'm just trying not to break the law. And so there's a lot of that. And I was always reporting on what just happened, or what happened last month, what happened last quarter. And, I really wanted to be like, look, your financials are doing this because of X, Y, Z. I was just drawn into the, trying to help teams understand their financials and how to control them. And then when I moved into that portfolio space, understanding how products were funded and the value that they were trying to drive, that just was like the next step of like, hey, these projects are trying to drive a certain outcome in the business, or support a certain outcome in the business, or just refresh our operations to make sure that we remain compliant and resilient. and then seeing the operations side of it, like ITIL operations, change control calls, engineer, like finance doesn't normally do finance in the middle of the night. Like seeing engineers do engineering work in the middle of the night, I'm like, you guys do this willingly? This is crazy. Like, so that was like
Why?
this is when you sleep. You do pivot tables in the afternoon and you sleep at night. And so it was like such an eye-opening moment to see like, oh, this is how you have to operate. So I was able to see like the financial impact of all these operations and the projects that we're trying to drive them all forward. So then when I fell into this cloud space and you have all this transactional information, like down to the second, and you have all these levers that you can pull to manage your environment to drive financial value, like that was just, it all came together.
All the information, all the data that you need. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. So let's think. So also let's ask, so guys out there, if you're listening, do any of you have a FinOps team? I'd be interested to know kind of if you have a FinOps team, what they're called, if you do, the different names. So some people call it FinOps team, some people call it CCOE element, or there's Cost Optimisation Team, which is what Joe called it. So there's a few different bits to it. So if anybody shares that. So day one, and Biddle, please feel free to chime in and say what you would do, because Michael Biddle always works with customers and helps kind of these massive companies, but obviously has experience doing kind of day one as well, starting up CCOE or FinOps team or whatever. So maybe actually, Michael, why don't you go first? What would be your kind of starting element to creating a FinOps team?
Yeah, and just to your question for the chat, I've heard it called a cloud business office. You'll see we'll put a link in the chat here in a few moments for Vanguard. They create their cloud business office. Zendesk is a cloud center of excellence. We'll give you guys a few examples so where you can check this out. But some of the real things I would start with when I'm looking at staffing and how do I design a cloud center of excellence is, number one, where do you create the separation of kind of like what is traditionally seen as church and state, or the separation of powers? Like where do you have your technology experts lie versus your financial experts? Even better if you can have experts in your organization that can rely on their skills for engineering and finance, but we know that sometimes that's a hard skill set to find. So what's really key here, and what I found in a lot of our experiences building these, is you're going to have situations where someone who's monitoring the finance and usage reports will come up with a really great opportunity for the business that can drive cost savings throughout the organization. However, sometimes you can meet some friction when you go to meet with the engineering and development teams that own those resources, where they have different perspectives that might not show up in just the finance and usage reports. Things such as compute latency on a machine, network bandwidth that they might need for a particular point in time in that application. And so that's why my experience is, and Joe, love to hear what you think too, we found it's best successful when you have someone that can be an intermediary layer between the finance team and the engineering team that can speak the language of both parties and come up with mutual solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought up Vanguard. Shout out to Tim Treston and his team because I really like how they operate. Yeah, like it's kind of funny when I was in that finance stage and I was trying to explain like capital funding and expense funding. Like I actually came up with a list of like, this is what this word means, this is what that word means, to try to like educate, because everyone uses, like, even if you say direct chargeback, which is a cloud financial management, FinOps, cloud optimization term, that may mean something completely different to finance. It could be like, oh, you're charging directly to the customer, you're charging directly to the business, as opposed to a cost center or disbursement. So there's so many different terms. It's really important to kind of find someone who understands not just like the financial terms in general and the technology terms in general, but how they're applied in your context.
Yes.
Because it is funny to watch like how many meetings you're in between different groups, and they just really don't understand each other, and how much time is just trying to see eye to eye. What are your experiences, and like, how have you, like, from a third party view, because Steph, you came from E&Y, right? Like
KPMG, close. They're all the
KPMG,
same.
accounting firms or consulting firms, they're all just accounting.
They're all the same.
Like, how did you help when you recognize that in customers? Like, what were the steps you took to try to bridge that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite, like, think back. I always mention this story, so probably apologies to everyone who's heard it many a time. But when I started the FinOps team at KPMG, one of the first things that we did was talked about chargeback, and it was understanding first what that meant, because I didn't really know what that meant. I just had come in as a developer and was just looking at numbers and trying to do coding and doing Python and Lambda just to fix things. But when I produced like a report, and I was like, this looks right. The person who's a developer looking at the curve, like, these columns make sense to me. And then after kind of getting to know the finance team and chatting to them, I realized they were like, well, I mean, it has the data, but then we need to reformat it and put it into like this format to go into SAP. And I was like, oh, okay, I can do that. And they were like, what do you mean you could do that? And I was like, well, I'll just change the code and I'll make it go into your format. And so suddenly this thing that had been a manual, like hours and hours process of them having to take, originally it was the actual invoice from Amazon and then doing all the breakdown of the costs from another Excel sheet, had gone into this nice kind of email they get on time every month that just had all the columns in the right format that they needed. And it was just like so simple. And I think it was one of my like proudest moments when I was able just to give the finance team a report that actually helped them. So yeah, love doing that.
I've always seen like the best way to get buy-in from finance is to show them how to export anything to Excel. And then they're like, I'm in.
That's the big win to understanding. Everyone loves it's whenever you use any kind of third-party tool, everyone wants to know, can you get it into a CSV? It's like the biggest part of it, especially for the finance guys, which I appreciate, because sometimes that's what you actually need to utilize rather than a pretty dashboard of some sort. So, okay, so we've covered the first thing. Number one is kind of getting that conversation between the developers and the kind of finance people when it comes to things like chargeback, especially. So when we think about optimization in general, so cost optimization, let's move into the concept of, we can see the costs now, we want to optimize. Joe, how do you get started? Because it will be interesting to hear over the two different teams that you've worked in, two different companies, how you've got engagement for optimization from developers.
Yeah, it's funny because like the first thing you have to do is enforce tagging. You have to have a tagging strategy. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. So tagging helps identify it. It makes a cryptic technological code meaningful to someone who can just look at it immediately. And so every time I shouldn't say every time, both times in my experience, when you introduce a cloud transformation program to a company, like the engineers, the developers are super excited to get started. They're like, oh, you just unlocked everything I need for it, which you didn't actually unlock everything, unless you're just the Wild West. But you're like, okay, and you need to tag that resource you just launched. And they're like, what? There's always that moment of buy-in. And so we say, please tag it with the application name or disbursement code or cost center that you're funding it with. And they'd be like, there are folks that say, I hate Joe Daly. Like I hate Joe Daly as a tag at both companies I've worked at.
Oh my God. That's so mean.
And it's so adorable because they're like, now you can see it. And like, yeah, I can see it. I can also see which engineer launched it. Like, it's once like all of a sudden you see that transparency, like, yes, I could see when you launched it, what time you launched it, and what time you said you hate me. And so it gets really good buy-in when they're like, oh, you really can see everything. And like, if I don't tag this right, you're going to continue to dig deeper to get to what you need. And I remember there was a meeting with a VP who said, what's this? Why am I getting charged for this? I'm like, well, it's not tagged, but let's dig a little bit layer deeper. Oh, it's the engineer on your team here. And I was like, I'll go talk to the person. And I was like, good news. You just got FaceTime with your boss's boss. Like, he knows your name now. Congratulations. Maybe next time tag. So it helps, like, it gets buy-in pretty quick. There's always that resistance, like, oh, you're adding bureaucracy, but it's just organization so you can manage.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Biddle, but the one thing that I find is like making it as simple as possible to do it. Because when we did things like having Terraform modules and CloudFormation kind of stacks, having the tags that you knew you needed like inbuilt and that were variables made it so much easier because you didn't even think about it. You just roll it. It's part of the deployment rather than it being this, oh, I have to go and manually tag. No. I should never be hearing the words manually tag things. That's a big thing for me. But Biddle, how have you seen people kind of take on tags?
Yeah, I mean, you put them in the formation templates, like step one, and obviously, not everything you're going to run in your environment's coming from formation template. As much as possible, we'd like to get it as infrastructure as code through those, but we know that those use cases exist outside of there, and it's really important that we're diligent with things such as like control policies within AWS. You can place policies as an administrator in your environment that would say, notify me, for example, or notify the resource owner if an EC2 instance is launched that doesn't have the 5 following tags associated with it. And then you can even take it one step further, like, email that person as the first step. You could create an automated step function within the console that would then either maybe delete the resource if you want to go that extreme, kind of leading from with a stick instead of leading with a carrot. It's up to you, right? But one thing I think is really important as we have this discussion is enabling the insights to when actions or when opportunities have been pointed out, who's taking action on them, like what step are they in with your engineering teams. And what we see a lot of customers have success with is using systems like Jira, Zendesk, other trouble ticketing systems, so that this central cloud center of excellence team of sorts can identify the opportunity, assign it through that ticketing mechanism, and then from there you kind of have a way of accountability to see the progress of how that tracks. Otherwise, these can kind of become very lost, passing spreadsheets over email back and forth. And then it's really hard to kind of get a good fence around what opportunities are being taken advantage of.
I 100% agree with that. Like you have to put the data, and this goes back to what we're talking about with finance too, is like, deliver the data to where they do the work. If they're managing their backlog in Jira, send it to Jira. If finance uses a certain CSV format, send them it in that format. Make it easy for them to adopt those policies.
Yeah, definitely. And just to shout out this question of what do you see as standard practice for getting started with tags, i.e. how many and how do you enforce? So we kind of covered the enforcement using kind of policies. I've popped in the chat 2 links, one to a new blog post about organization tagging, so a way in which you can look at doing kind of cost allocation from the top down. So rather than tagging all of your individual resources, which can sometimes be a bit harder, especially like Biddle said, you can't tag everything necessarily, using that account structure. And we've also had a new well-architected lab published on tagging. So I've popped those in the chat. So I'll throw them up on screen now just to showcase them. So that is the blog. So feel free to check it out, and the lab. So, okay, so we talked about tagging. So that's the strategy of seeing your costs and things like that. So let's take an example. You've got your instances tagged. Say you've got an EC2 instance. It's, I don't know, an M5 24x large, and it's got kind of no CPU. It's got a 1% or one kind of CPU metric. What would be the way that you would go and engage with the engineers to kind of say, oh, this is something for you to look at? How would you start with that, Joe?
The first thing to do is to, so this is where the Jira thing comes into play. If you don't give any sort of context information, it's just like, okay, I have an idle server, and it goes into the backlog and it sits there. Meanwhile, you're getting charged by the hour, maybe the second, or however that service is being charged, and you're still incurring the fees. So what's really important is to put that context information in there, like, hey, this is how we've spent X number of dollars over the last 7 days or last 30 days or this year, and the utilization is really low. What is it supporting? And you just kind of engage that conversation. So you put the dollar impact to the business, the financial impact to the business, and the engineer will be like, well, I can fix that. If I fix that, it gets it gets prioritized up the backlog. And it can also get the engagement of the engineer to be like, I had an impact by doing this really simple update. Because number one thing you want to know is, I mean, that's assuming that it's you should fix it. There's also what is it supporting? Are you turning it off? Is it right sized? Is it? There's all sorts of questions, but it's really important to know, like, what is that application and business function supporting? Because maybe it's for a customer report, and the customer, maybe it's seasonal, maybe it's not. There's how you handle it is how you solve for it or how you handle it really depends on what it's doing with the business.
Yeah, cool. And Biddle, what about? I mean, when you talk to your customers, you must be trying to convince, not necessarily convince them, but shed light on some services like this. How do you try and get engagement from, if you're speaking to the managers, they're like, yeah, we want to save money, but how do you kind of get that through to maybe the engineers?
Yeah, well, here's a common problem that you'll see happen throughout organizations is, and no fault to anyone's self, it's you're running a very diverse set of applications in your portfolio. And so here's a scenario. You get a report that shows that you have utilization of X% across your CPU and memory in these specific instances. And then what naturally happens is, okay, well, what does good look like for this instance or this application type? Can the engineering team define, is it 50% CPU is kind of my baseline I should be expecting for this workload? Is it, 40% memory? Is it 1,000 bytes of network read write at any given moment? These are the things that when we talk about when you kind of first try to set up your cloud center of excellence or your cloud business office, trying to establish what the baseline of what would good look like for each of these applications, establish that in the beginning, because then you avoid the headache at the end of the process where once you've identified these, trying to then work backwards. So what does good look like? And that can create a lot of back and forth, which will paralyze the organization to the point where you're, 3-6 months later before you're making any change. And in the meantime, a lot of savings could have been had. So my recommendation, and this is what I try and coach all my customers for, is let's take a particular application. Let's say this is my web server streaming internet video content out to my customers. Well, over a 1-month period, I would expect to have this particular instance having X CPU, X memory, X network, and X EBS, read write throughput speed, and then set that as a standard. And then within CloudWatch, you can create these alarms that will look at over every 2 weeks or month of your environment if that threshold is not being met that you've defined of what good looks like for that application. That way, when you have your usage reports that Joe and other teams look at, you can combine that with the alarms that have been set from an agreed upon mutually standard of what good looks like, because then that helps you cut through, like I said, a lot of the red tape phase back and forth, maybe some of the infighting, and everyone's got the best intentions, right? But this is just my advice, because paralysis by analysis is a real thing, and that's what we want to try and help you avoid.
That's a great phrase. I like that. Yeah, I think you're right. It's getting kind of things started and making sure you have that scope defined is a great way to kind of kick off. And for those that may be just joining us or joining us in halfway through, we're chatting about kind of getting started with a FinOps team or a cost optimization team and sharing stories on that. So if you've any tips, if you've started a FinOps team and you think this is what we've done is really good, you want to share that, please feel free to share your comments or ask questions, any specifics in the chat. So maybe looking at time, let's go into one quick kind of last thing that you want to share for anybody starting out tomorrow. They're starting a new job, they're starting a FinOps team. What would be your kind of another point to get them going for success? Joe, why don't you start?
Know everything about the cloud and every technology and all the rates and everything. No, there's so much information. Do not feel like you need to be the expert at all of it. And there's tons of support resources out there for you. One, there's like all the well-architected labs and blogs that you put in the chat. There's also the FinOps Foundation, which is an organization for FinOps practitioners. Go check it out at finops.org. You can reach out to other folks who are doing this same sort of exercise. It's all the same problems in different contexts. So you can learn how other companies and other folks are approaching the same problems very similar problems that you are going to face and learn from the community.
Definitely a great tip. I've checked that on the page. Really recommend checking them out. You can obviously get cool swag like me and Joe are wearing today. A big
shirts.
Yeah. But they're a great starting point. The resources on there are really good. The blogs on there are really good. And also they do regular meetups, so you can kind of share knowledge and learn from peers and experiences from other people. And kind of, even if you're starting out and you are starting out, or even if you're an expert, there's always things to learn when it comes to cost optimization. So, but all about you, kind of top tips on moving forward.
Yeah, about the FinOps Foundation. Shout out to Jason Bauer with Here automobile mapping company. They do a fantastic job of speaking how they run their company. Great point of example to look at. My advice would be this, right? An object in motion stays in motion. Incremental progress is good. Like, don't be afraid to get the ball rolling, even if you haven't necessarily built the perfect mousetrap or mechanism that can do everything you want in it. Don't pause progress you can have now in the effort to get the most perfect, excellent solution that can happen later, right? It's kind of an iterative process. And so first things first is identify and define who in your organization is that purple unicorn that can do both the engineering and the resource architecture along with the finance and usage insights and like quantitative analysis. If you don't have that, then identify who is interested in your organization to take an ownership stake and eat both of those sides so they can work together to kind of evangelize this throughout the company, right? Once you've identified your people, then work backwards on those mechanisms that you'd want to have in place to give you the insights. Things that we mentioned earlier, such as control policies that let you know when things are out of the scope of what you want tagged on every instance. Define what is good for a set of applications or a team that you can then create these CloudWatch alarms. And then kind of from that point, that's when you're going to start getting more granular with the cost and usage report to define and see who's creating these charges, how can you allocate it back? And then kind of the last component of this really is how do you enable ongoing education and enablement? Some customers will create wikis that are like a central repository where different teams can share knowledge. Some customers will have like an internal SharePoint where they'll control that flow of what goes into there as best practice. You'll probably find your organization will have a lot of people that want to put forth ideas that they think are good, and they have the right intentions, but you still kind of want to have someone in your central business office or cloud center of excellence that is vetting to some degree what gets put onto those education wikis. Because it might work for someone in their own hacky solution, but maybe some other part of the organization that you have a preview over because you can see horizontally has a better, more refined approach, and you can kind of integrate that solution instead. But the point being is you have to anchor all of these things with that ongoing enablement mechanism. So that's a wiki, SharePoint, whatever. Definitely get that going and reach out to your AWS account representative and get a team like Optics involved to help you make that.
Shout out to the rest of our Optics team helping customers save money everywhere. And so we've got like a couple of minutes left. So really quick kind of segue into any favorite kind of quick stories about when you were doing your kind of cost optimization, especially as a team or as a kind of central unit that you're really proud of. Joe, do you want to go?
Oh man, there's just like
too many.
Too many. No, but what's awesome. So here's what I'm proud of is this is not easy. If it was easy, this industry, like you two wouldn't have a Twitch show. There wouldn't be the FinOps Foundation. There wouldn't be all sorts of Google Cloud money, and there's it's huge. This is not easy stuff. And probably one of the most proud moments was for me last week. The CIO of my group, we were going over a business case that involved cloud, and he's pointed to me. He's like, "The FinOps team is the source of the truth," and that was like one of those "Oh my God" sort of moments. And it was just so cool. It's like we have credibility here, and it's all based off of completely transparent information of how people are how applications are behaving and programmed to behave in the cloud. So that was an awesome moment just to see the level of buy-in and credibility that we've been able to create.
That's so cool. The source of truth is a definite thing to win when it comes to cost, because
it's the first time
there's too many things that you're like.
Yeah.
Bill,
I've had many other names.
I'll just give a real quick one. Sometimes the simplest solutions are some of the best, right? And what I really like is the example from going back to the Vanguard thing. Since we put it in the chat, you guys can watch it. They do a pretty good dive into. So they had this Cloud Center of Excellence established. They have their metrics in place, and then they were getting alarms that their CloudWatch metric costs went up like 1,000% over a period of a few days. And that Cloud Center of Excellence team really dove into specifically the cost and usage report to see what was creating those metrics. They went back into the IAM console to see which resources are triggering these additional metric calls for CloudWatch. And what they found was that there's a team of engineers that wanted to get more granular insight on their application. So they enabled 1 minute metric visibility instead of the free 5 minute metric visibility. And it caused the cost to go up. They're able to catch it real quick within a span of about a week and rectify it back down and save their costs. And it's back to what Joe's saying, this is the team that's the center of truth, that has that horizontal view that can kind of be that Batman figure of sorts, overlooking everything and jumping in when needed to. So that's
interesting choice of DC rather than a Marvel person. Oh, interesting. Right. Okay. So we are at time. So thank you to our cool guest Joe today and Biddle as always. Next week we will be chatting about Graviton. So we're going to do a 2-part episode on Graviton, all about it. If you've never heard of it, check it out, do a Google in the meantime. A great opportunity for cost optimization. And we will see you next week. See you later.